Welcome to this special edition of the TDi podcast series, Suits and Boots, brought to you as part of TDi's strategic partnership with Mining Indaba 2025. I'm Elizabeth Arnott, Responsible Mining Consultant at TDi, and I'm joined today by three representatives from different parts of the mining industry who will be speaking at this year's Mining Indaba event in Cape Town. Over the course of this series of special edition podcasts, we'll be discussing the key themes of this year's event. Today's topic is Industrialising Africa, and we'll be talking about Africa's infrastructure potential, how to develop strong downstream economies, and what it will take to enable international players to invest in local value addition for critical transition minerals. I'm delighted to be joined by Darias Jonker, Head of Government and International Relations, Americas, at Anglo, a global diversified mining company listed on the London and Johannesburg stock exchanges. He previously supported Anglo-American's regional renewable energy ecosystem in Southern Africa through strategic advice and policy analysis. Darias spent much of his early career in the South African Foreign Service, focusing on bilateral political relations with key international partners. Also with us today is Dr. Aditya Ramji, Director at the Global South Clean Transportation Center at the University of California. Aditya's work focuses on policy and regulatory design for low-emission transport and critical mineral supply chains for energy transitions. He also previously worked for a leading automotive major in India, where he was involved in the company's vision for electrification and overall business strategy. Finally, Hajduka, CEO and founder of Africa GreenCo, a renewable energy buyer and trader operating in Southern Africa, purchasing power from renewable energy generators and selling that electricity to utilities, private sector off-takers, national power trading markets, and to the competitive markets of the Southern Africa power pool. Anna is an infrastructure and energy professional with more than 20 years' experience in public-private partnerships and project development, working on energy and infrastructure projects in emerging markets. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Let's start by discussing what we mean when we talk about industrializing Africa. African countries produce more than 60 metal and mineral products, and as we are all well aware, has huge potential with respect to mineral reserves, exploration, and production. Africa presents a new investment frontier for leading mining firms, but despite the significant resources held by the continent, it represents only about 8% of formal global mineral production. Expenditure on exploration activity remains low, and most of the minerals produced are still exported without mid or downstream processing, thereby reducing the potential to add value. So, Aditya, what do you think needs to happen to increase investment in midstream and downstream manufacturing to create local value addition for critical energy transition minerals?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. But maybe let me address this take a step back, right? I mean, I think while we've been talking about critical materials and energy transition minerals, there has been a lot of focus on this from just a clean energy supply chain perspective. But part of it that we forget often is many of these minerals have been and continue to be used in other non-energy sectors, in infrastructure and elsewhere, where they have a base demand. And especially in countries in Africa and on the continent, as economies are growing, just from a basic economic growth standpoint, a lot of this base demand will increase and is expected to happen. I'm not saying that they won't meet their clean energy goals or whatever, but that is going to have its own staggered phase in over the next decade or so. So it's important to think about these minerals from a mineral standpoint, right? I mean, the minerals market reacts to total demand, not only to clean energy demand or a particular sector. But this is where I think, especially for Africa and countries there that are kind of getting into this space more actively now, they can avoid some of the pitfalls that some of the other countries in Latin America and elsewhere have done when it comes to, deciding how to kind of navigate this critical minerals value chain approach. So I think the first thing I would think about and suggest is creating what I like to call a mineral budget, right? So essentially what it does is it tells you as a country that or a region, for all my total requirements, here is all the minerals I require by sector, right? And then here is what I have, here is what I don't have. And then it really then helps you think about how to which part. So for the resources you have, then it helps you think about what you will need domestically, what other markets will need, how much to invest in, where are your opportunities, and then also to say that gives you better perspective of the things that you don't have that you need from others, but then it gives you a better way of leveraging agreements and contracts, and not just make it a cash for resources approach. And the last thing I will say is like you rightly pointed out, I mean, countries in Africa do already produce minerals and metals and export to the rest of the world, which also means that they do have what I would like to call adjacent capabilities in terms of knowing how to deal with the minerals and metals sector. And some of those skills can be transferred to the minerals that are now in big focus from the energy transition perspective. And I think this is the kind of ecosystem thought process that in my mind can really help unlock and find viable opportunities for investment in midstream and downstream manufacturing, and value creation, right? And then help create a strategy. The last thing I will say, though, is within Africa, I think at an individual level, some of these countries may not offer the big domestic market demand or whatever else. But I think this is where also there might be a lot of value in regional integration to create a very strong ecosystem approach and scale for capital to flow in.
No, thanks, Aditya. What I would add to that is, in your analysis of supply and demand, the supply really is the key issue here. I talk about the three S's, supply being one of them. The size of the demand is really just unprecedented. From this base demand, like you described, from the demands of the energy transition, and also the demands of artificial intelligence. The amount of copper in particular required by a data center is very, very intense. And that's just for the data center itself, the cooling, the wiring, small amounts in the chips themselves, but the connectors, there's so many needs for copper in a data center. And then, of course, the power required for the data center, that takes up a whole other amount of copper, and then the transmission. It's really a very different level of supply that we are talking about, which in turn is the second S, which is the scale of investment in particular. We look at copper mainly at the moment for our growth pipeline at Anglo American, and at least $200 billion have to go into upstream copper production over the next few decades just to meet demand. And then, of course, the speed at which this needs to happen to not have inflationary impact on the market, to allow for climate goals to be achieved, etc. So those are the three S's. Now, that's really looking at the upstream. But if you look at what that means for the midstream and the downstream, we need a lot more midstream capacity. But for the market to determine that means that you really need a comparative advantage. In Africa's case, given the abundance of resources, that is your comparative advantage, right? Your location to the resource. But we do need power, we do need water, we do need transport infrastructure, we need the skills. Otherwise, you can't compete. So looking forward to what Anna has to say about supplying many of those elements. But what I would still add to that is that there are some people and some entities and organizations and countries and governments, etc., who do not factor comparative advantage into the equation, who would want to have a separate supply chain for different reasons, geopolitical reasons, national security reasons, etc. And if that is your motivator, you have to be willing to subsidize the fact that that midstream project you're wanting to put in place will not be competitive, will not be sufficiently competitive. If you look at China's midstream copper smelting and refining capacity, particularly on the smelting side, where concentrate gets smelted as the first step in the processing process. At the moment, these smelters are bidding at zero prices or negative prices even to process the concentrate because there's such fierce competition given the limited supply of concentrate coming in at the moment. So it's really something which, if you base it purely on market fundamentals, is very, very hard to pull off. And this is the reality that policymakers and other stakeholders really need to consider when they're looking at how to develop the midstream and the downstream in Africa.
What opportunities do you think exist to unlock these segments? Thinking about, battery and vehicle manufacturers, and perhaps drawing on some of your previous experience in the automotive industry.
Yeah, sure. No, I think just to draw on what Darias just said, I think you're right. I mean, but just looking at this from an investment standpoint, at the end of the day, investment also needs certain de-risking, right, and certainty. I mean, that's where I think also policy and regulation plays a strong role. So I think it's equally important, especially when you're looking at the full value chain, for a lot of these countries to think about a more holistic, systemic approach to this. To say, okay, while we're looking at upstream and we're looking at midstream, there are also, we do need to create market certainty for downstream, because that's when you really trigger the ecosystem to kind of react, and hopefully in an efficient manner. And to your point, right? I mean, the geopolitics element can't be wished away, and I think that is going to be there. And with this general push for diversification of especially midstream, which often never gets talked about, I think there is a huge opportunity in Africa, for example, to be able to leverage the midstream piece. I mean, already we're seeing countries not wanting to export plain raw materials and wanting to actually do processing locally, and that's fine. And I think, and this is why my earlier point on adjacent capabilities being, how to identify those and be able to leverage some of that, which makes it a slightly easier lift. So you're not starting from zero, right? You're starting from maybe 10 or 11 to get to 20 or 30 or whatever. So anyway, but just to come back to your point, Elizabeth, on some of the downstream, I think there is a huge opportunity, and it's not difficult. I mean, yes, in Africa in general, manufacturing, at least on the battery and EVs and the vehicle manufacturing side, hasn't been historically there. Barring South Africa, I think most other countries do assembly. But when you look at electric vehicles, and I'm just coming from Kenya, actually spending a few weeks ago, and it was very impressive to see, although they've generally been historically, IC engine assembly players, in the EV side, they're seeing increasing amount of investments setting up new EV manufacturing facilities. And this is what's interesting, right? Compared to the usual narrative in the US and the EU of just a car-centric approach, markets in Africa and other developing countries also have 2 and 3 wheelers. And these are technology elements that aren't very complex and can easily be created and taken up, on the continent. And this is what we're seeing in Kenya. I mean, the likes of Ampersand and Rome and others, there are such companies who are, already starting to invest heavily in manufacturing. On the EV side, I think this is a huge leapfrogging opportunity on the continent to kind of, create themselves as potential movers and leaders in the space going forward. And the whole ecosystem there, and the market in general, is going to see a huge amount of mobility demand. It's heavily underserved. There's a huge potential, and I think there is an opportunity for them to kind of create that readiness. And the same thing goes with the battery ecosystem. I mean, you have minerals. The continent as a whole, especially with a regional approach, can unlock a lot of domestic appetite, which also then creates a lot of interest for capital to flow in, because usually what capital likes is, can I access the domestic market and also the export ecosystem? And I think from a regional standpoint and integration, Africa can actually offer a lot of that potential and be able to do this. So to the point that they have these things, it's not that you don't. There are countries that have, if you put together a cluster of them, they have the right set of minerals, and you're already seeing downstream investments happening. So a combination of policy certainty and some careful thought to planning, I think can really provide a huge boost to the region in terms of becoming the next hub for a lot of this.
So to build on that, what role do you think that the private sector and state-owned enterprises can or should play to implement local government visions to deliver greater value addition?
This is an interesting space, right, where often we're seeing, I'll use the same Kenya example, it has been private sector, at least on the downstream side, that has been the proactive driver of policy decision making, right? Not the other way around. Usually we wait for policy to happen and then hope that the private sector would react. I think in Africa, there is a huge potential for industry to be driving policy. And I mean this in a good way, right? But being the trigger for government to be more reactive and kind of take concrete steps and be able to do that. So I think there is a lot of potential for the private sector to drive this across the value chain, right? We're already seeing this happen downstream. There is stuff on the mining side. But I think this is where on the upstream ecosystem, where I think you will need both private sector and state-owned players to kind of work more in cohesion. One, that this is a space that's a little bit more fragmented. There are smaller mines, there are big mines. There's a lot of there is a structural ecosystem that needs to be navigated. But then also that many countries with resource nationalization and everything else, there is a greater play that we're seeing of state-owned enterprises coming in, especially on the upstream side. But what would be most important is they have to think about a few things, right? One, ensuring that they meet the goals of the social ecosystem in which they're operating at a site level, right? How do you ensure that you have community benefits transfers, you have all of these other things? And then at a higher level, that's at the local government level. And one step above is also being able to think about how all of this can translate into creating an attractive investment option, right? Where you are meeting your so-called, what we otherwise like to call ESG, but essentially you're able to create an attractive investment decision framework where then you're bringing in a lot more capital. I think that will also mean that you're able to then create, have access to a lot more lower cost capital and competitive capital, which can really drive a lot of this and help meet government vision in the region.
Really what struck me most about what you said there was how the market reacts to mineral demand, not just in terms of demand for critical minerals for a clean energy transition. So kind of what I heard there was that this means that we can't just have the conversation about the green transition in isolation, but take a more holistic approach and perspective, which includes, things exactly what you just mentioned around de-risking and creating attractive investment opportunities all the way through to, building midstream capacity. So thanks for that. That was very insightful. So Darias, I'd like to turn to you for a moment. You're speaking at this year's Mining Indaba event about a successful Brazilian public-private partnership infrastructure model and how that could be replicated in African countries. Could you please explain a little bit about what led to that model being adopted by the mining sector in Brazil?
No, thanks, Elizabeth. And I'm moderating a panel on the topic, so I'm not going to give myself out as an expert on the topic. But I do know enough to know that the Brazilian model is certainly one that Africa can learn from. And it's essentially one of privatization. Now, Aditya was talking about new state-owned enterprises stepping into these supply chains. If we look at the Brazilian example, it's a case of the state-owned enterprises stepping out. And why do state-owned enterprises get privatized when they do get privatized? It's essentially an issue of efficiency. They are no longer efficient, and they need to be privatized to become more efficient. Now, some people might call that the neoliberal consensus, but it is how markets work. These mining companies require enormous amounts of capital. They need to be extremely efficient. They cannot overpay for services. And so it's that need that I spoke of earlier for large amounts of capital to be deployed, for that capital to be efficiently deployed, which demand the most efficient infrastructure available. Now, sometimes the market prices are so high that they allow for those inefficiencies to be tolerated. But over the long term, as you go through the cycles, it can make or break an industry in a country. And again, in Zambia's case, the cost of electricity is a key factor in the future of the copper industry over there. But now, if you look at what happened in Brazil, and it's similar to what happened in South Africa, you had governments driven by nationalist objectives who had enough money at the right time to plow that into establishing an ecosystem for the iron ore industry in the case of Brazil. So there was the resource, there was the state-owned company, Vale, who developed their own railways, other state-owned companies who developed more railways, who developed the ports, other state-owned companies that developed the steel mills. And so you had a heavily subsidized steel-making industry. And that worked for many decades, but it stopped working and privatization was necessary. And so you saw that about 30 odd years ago in Brazil. You saw that in South Africa as well with the steel industry and how it was developed there. But 30 years ago when South Africa started privatizing, they stopped when it came to the transport infrastructure. So they privatized the mines, they privatized the steel mills, but they didn't privatize the infrastructure. What South Africa is now realizing is that some kind of model along the lines of a public-private service agreement could work. And so that is being actively explored over there. If you look in Angola's case, with the Lobito corridor being upgraded, it's a railway line that's being upgraded to anticipate the demand from the rail users who would be the mines in Zambia and the DRC. That's how they're factoring the model. But the devil is, of course, really in the detail, and that's what we'll be exploring on this panel. What really worked well in Brazil, what didn't, how can you learn from that? And in the case of Southern Africa and Africa in general, because so many of these projects will be going across borders, because there's significant infrastructure backlogs in some of the areas, you really need a wide range of strategic stakeholders to come on board. So it's a strategic stakeholder engagement approach that is necessary, bringing in international financial institutions, bringing in regional financial institutions, bringing in donor countries, bringing in the private sector, bringing in the OEMs. And that's how you create this ecosystem to really pull off these multi-billion-dollar projects, because it's not just one that's going to happen. You're going to have a number happening all at the same time.
Thanks so much, Darias. Those were very interesting case studies. Anna, are you able to provide any comments here based on your previous experience of private-public partnership models?
In a way, I wanted to talk about the public-private partnership models in the energy sector. So not, complementing the mining sector. I think what we see as, in my view, the most exciting new PPP model in the SADC region is what South Africa is planning to do when it comes to private sector participation in investing in transmission lines, kind of the new transmission type of REIPP office that is being set up in South Africa. I hear the point that was raised by Darias about, is this kind of a neoliberal argument or not? The fact is it's kind of irrelevant. There's just no money available when it comes to fiscal support for new large infrastructure projects, taking into account the indebtedness levels of most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, to support them without private sector participation and new PPP models. Would I necessarily recommend direct privatization of transmission and other infrastructure immediately? Perhaps not. I think what South Africa is contemplating more as a PPP model would work better, attracting private sector capital, temporary ownership, and then perhaps sending it back into the hands of the state-owned entity as a more gradual transition to an overall market opening. That's something that we are looking at as a significant example, without which there simply will not be energy transition in Africa. We've spoken for decades about generation and what is required in terms of new generation capacity, completely ignoring the fact that we can have as much generation as we want, but without transmission and distribution investment that is equal or more than that into the generation, we simply will not be able to supply those very mining customers and others, residential, etc., that need new supply, because the grids are very, very old. The challenges of intermittent absorptions are real. And as we can see in South Africa at the moment, there's significant transmission congestion that simply doesn't allow us to transfer those electrons from A to B where they are needed. So very exciting to see what will happen in the PPP space when it comes to new investments in the transmission space across the region.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that very insightful and honest answer. Darias, how is the reform of infrastructure projects in Africa already benefiting the mining sector in countries like South Africa and Angola?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. If you look at Angola, the progress that has been made there in building out the energy infrastructure over the past few years, how they've partnered with international financial institutions, regional financial institutions, that's setting the country on a good course to provide green energy where it is needed by the mining sector. Now, it's not privatized in the purest sense of the word, but the public-private partnership models certainly are paving the way for effective deployment. And so in that sense, we do get comfort from it. If you look in South Africa's case, again, there, like I mentioned earlier, with the rail reforms, we are seeing progress. But it's slow going in South Africa's case. But at the same time, you will be laying down these projects for decades and decades to come. So make sure you do it right. Make sure you get everybody on board so that it's built for the long haul. Excuse the pun. But it really needs to work. You can't mess around. And that's what we're trying to contribute with our discussion at Indaba, is to really find the right model that works and that is the most sustainable solution.
And how do you think trade can be encouraged between African countries, and what benefits could this have in terms of value addition?
So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is really the most significant development in that regard over the last 10 odd years, as it has been developed and rolled out. Generally speaking, the trade in minerals is not really tariffed, but everything else that is required to put in an upstream project, to put in a midstream project, usually is. And so by bringing down those tariffs, you really are going to see a significant reduction in costs. And then the borders that I spoke of earlier, the fact that so many of these projects will be dependent on how borders are managed and administered, how border posts are run, how the movement of goods and people can be facilitated and optimized. That's really what we need to see more of. And it's starting to show progress. You know, in Zimbabwe, there's been good progress with some of the border posts there. And so that, again, gives us encouragement. And then ports, really to see how ports can learn from each other, how they can work together. You're seeing some players who operate a number of ports in the same region, the benefits of scale that come from that. That's really what you want to see, because you have to optimize as much as you possibly can.
Thanks so much for that. Anna, your work has shown that regional power pools can be instrumental in supplying both residential and mining customers in drought countries by facilitating imports from other countries in the region. Could you please comment here on the benefits that cross-border energy trade can provide in mitigating localized energy shortages that affect the mining industry?
Yeah, I would completely agree with you that cross-border energy trade is truly transformative and extraordinarily important for both integration of new renewables and for supply to both industrial, mining, residential, and other customers during energy shortages. So as noted, our headquarters as GreenCo are in Lusaka, Zambia. And as you may know, there has been a severe drought that hit both Zambia and Zimbabwe and the Kariba Dam over the past year, starting from around May 2024 onwards. And it's been extremely, extremely difficult for the government, for all the mining, industrial, residential, and other commercial users, with ourselves on the residential side having around 3 hours of supply per day if we are lucky. So what the power pools and the regional power trade facilitated for Zambia and for the customers in Zambia is imports during this time. So for both Zambia and Zimbabwe, the imports were mainly from countries such as Mozambique and South Africa that luckily found themselves in a better position throughout 2024 in order, i.e. they had excess supply at certain months. And truly without that, we would have had potentially total system collapse and significant load shedding in Zambia and Zimbabwe and a few other countries in the region. For us as GreenCo and for our mining customers, I can give you an example, and it's more of an almost public-private partnership example, where we partnered with ZESCO, the utility in Zambia, to facilitate their ability to fund via us and in collaboration with First Quantum Minerals, the copper miner in Zambia, additional electricity imports from South Africa. And this started around September last year and really helped alleviate some of the energy crisis in Zambia caused by the drought. So we are and have been importing, more than 125 megawatts for the First Quantum's mining operations in Zambia. But the beauty of the transactions is that 125 megawatts that we've imported, not all of it is going to First Quantum and the other industrial and commercial customers that we serve. We actually supply most of it or bank most of it with ZESCO, i.e. we deposit it with them. Up to 85 megawatts per hour is deposited to ZESCO. Why? So they can stabilize or help stabilize Zambia's national grid in order to provide certain supply and reliability to hospitals, households, universities, etc., So not only to reduce the impact of load shedding on the industrial and mining customers, but also the residential and system security as a whole. And that's the beauty of the PPP structure that we entered into. It's not only imports that facilitated the ability of First Quantum not to have to load shed, but it's also imports that we did on behalf of ZESCO for wider customer base and system stability. And you may ask us, so what's the benefit to us of doing that? Well, the benefit to us as a trader is that we can wait. We can unbank or redeposit that 85 megawatts over a 2-year period in the future, and then blend that hydro once the load shedding is over and the Kariba dam levels are better and the rains start, blended with our renewable energy supply, therefore ensuring that we are more capable to ourselves as a supplier to industrial and mining customers, give them a stable, non-intermittent blend from our end. So really, cross-border energy trade is instrumental. It has helped Zambia and Zimbabwe, and is helping and has been for years now, DRC, to be able to function, notwithstanding the difficulties that these countries may be experiencing due to drought and a number of other reasons.
Thanks so much for that. The example of Zambia, I think, really demonstrates what an important role the correct PPP models can play. I was going to ask you about regional power pools, like you've mentioned, and how these help address energy security challenges faced by mining operations in critical mineral-rich countries such as South Africa, the DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe. Whether regional power pools incentivize investments in renewable energy projects to help ensure stable electricity supply for mining intensive economies.
Absolutely. I mean, the mining companies, some of them are trying to venture into the renewable energy supply to ensure their own energy security, and that's absolutely fine. But most of them, they're mining companies. They are focused on what they do best. In those cases, entities like GreenCo that have access to the regional power pools that are members of the Southern African Power Pool, we can look at supply and demand on a regional basis. We see where, and not only supply and demand dynamics, we have to take into account supply and demand dynamics. We have to take into account different commodity price spikes and declines, so to speak. We can see what happened to platinum prices last year. Therefore, we can alleviate the supply to some of our platinum customers to our other customers, which have had a much better year, such as, for example, gold producing customers in Zimbabwe. So you can look at it very systemically, and then you have to look at it from the perspective of technical viability. At the end of the day, it's all about, can you actually deliver that electron? And that's really dependent on, is there sufficient interconnection? What is the transfer capacity? What are the transfer capacity limits that may or may not allow you to import and export? And those technical issues are extraordinarily important, because that is what hits these mining companies on a daily basis. When the grids are not stable, when the transmission challenges are there. I mean, we could have, for example, imported much more for Zambia, but we were physically not able to, because there was the transfer capacity limits were at their very maximum. So that's why, again, truly what we all, I think, as a ecosystem need to start redirecting and looking at transmission and distribution challenges, because generation is easy when those challenges are overcome. And looking at those challenges and those multi-billion investments in new transmission and distribution grids can really be done most optimally by combining it with the diversification of risks that regional power pools provide all of us with. And interestingly enough, just also to conclude, the countries that you mentioned, South Africa, DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they are all rich in critical minerals, which are essential for the global energy transition. I think the whole world has this almost incentive now. It's no longer, it's an equal incentive. It's a synergy to start seeing that these companies receiving stable and reliable electricity and decarbonizing their mining operations in the countries of their operation across Africa that is an instrumental piece that will allow us globally to achieve the energy transition. And within that lens, we all should understand, I think, that regional power pools is the way through which we can most attractively and with best risk mitigation attract significant new funding to ensure that that reliable electricity is there.
Thanks for those insights, Anna. Deploying renewable energy will be key for Africa to achieve its climate, economic, and development goals. What's required for Africa's own energy transition to pick up the pace?
I think I would perhaps link this to my previous answer.
Mm-hmm.
What's required and what's needed to accelerate the transition is this convergence of interest between Africa and the world. Mm-hmm. So, the global demand drive for African critical minerals is essential for decarbonization of the world and for the renewable energy and electric vehicle industries. The sooner we all understand that the world can't achieve or will, with more difficulties, achieve its energy transition without Africa's resources, the sooner we may all come together to deploy innovative new investment models that will result in significant new generation distribution and transmission infrastructure investment needed for the extraction of those critical minerals to take place in the first place. What is also needed is a level of, it's for the countries themselves on the continent to see this picture and to understand how to play this geopolitical need. And this is where geopolitics then come in. This is where the countries and the governments of the relevant countries that are in this opportune moment in time need to really come up with modalities that work for them and that attract most sustainably and with the best value add investment into their mining and electricity sectors. So really the onus is all on us, but also on of course, the leaders of the countries at hand.
Thanks so much. Aditya or Darias, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Sure. I think the only thing I'll say is, from the element on renewable energy and just electricity development in the continent, I think has two elements. It's not just for the minerals and whatnot and resources, but it's also, the continent does have its own electricity access issues in general for its own people and ecosystem. And I think the thinking around this needs to be a more systems approach where, you're creating this not just for others, but also for your own self.
Thanks so much. So a very important question that I think is on the top of the agenda of, many CSOs, NGOs. How can governments across Africa ensure that development is not at the detriment of local communities, particularly in areas of sub-Saharan Africa where many communities still don't have any power?
I can have a go at that.
Sure.
So if you look at the example of what Anglo Americans doing with our Inbusa Energy initiative in Southern Africa, where we've partnered with EDFR and local players to really build out a vast system. What we've done is we've followed the model that the country set with its initial rollout of renewable energy, where there was a requirement to plow profits from the projects back into local communities. And we voluntarily decided to do that with our projects as well. And so a certain percentage goes into a pot. That pot gets dispersed to socioeconomic development projects in those communities. To identify those projects, we go into elaborate consultations with the local communities to identify their needs, to help them think through the kind of projects they want to see. And so you really leave a lasting legacy. And because these projects are expected to run for decades and decades, those revenues will continue to be streaming in. So you can really have significant impact given that lengthy timeline to which to invest in these projects.
If I can just add, I just want to say that, to Darius' point, but also that, this is where I think really thinking about community benefits and community benefit transfer, like model agreements, etc., are important. What's important for communities, depending on where they're located, can be different things. And I think being sensitive to that and being able to think about those things, and these are not stagnant, right? These priorities evolve and these needs evolve. So when we start a project today, there might be things that we might think is useful for socioeconomic development for the next 5 years. But being able to keep thinking about that, I mean, to Darius' point, there's always revenues coming in, but being able to be agile and think about how to leverage that investment back to the community so that it keeps adding and meets future needs. I think that perspective is important to be able to build in so that you really build a strong relationship around this. And the last thing is also that, just doing, I mean, we extract minerals, resources from the site. What happens once the mine is done, right? So how do you create a longer term capability in the community to be resilient, I think is also very important.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I completely agree. Being sensitive and context specific, staying up to date, those are all very important points. So thanks so much. All right, as we wrap things up, I have one final question for all of you, and that is if there is a single key message that you'd like listeners of this episode to take away from our conversation today, what is it?
I would say that business as usual will not deliver what needs to be delivered. This really is a time for new ways of thinking, for an appreciation of the scale required, for new types of capital to emerge, and for a new type of collaboration to happen.
I would just echo that, but just to say that, I think industrializing Africa is not a dream. It's very achievable, but I think there's a lot of power in regional cooperation and efforts on the continent that can really, really take this from 1 to 100.
Yeah, I would fully agree on the innovative business models, but really the key message I'd like everyone to take away is that Africa's energy transition and the global drive for decarbonization are deeply interconnected. So we finally have a synergy, and this synergy should result in the ability for countries on the continent to not only scale their energy sector, therefore industries and mining, but to create the local economic, industrial, and energy access, growth and opportunities. And that synergy, and the fact that we are actually speaking today about it during these podcasts in advance of the Mining Indaba, it's been an incredible shift over the past, 2-3 years. You can see it at the Mining Indaba. Energy is becoming more and more topical. It's like the energy mining nexus is now the topical point and discussion at the Mining Indaba. This didn't used to be the case. It was two separate camps and sometimes two separate, not so much favorable camps, because the renewable energy, especially the clean energy camp, was not normally associated with the mining industry, and how the two are completely linked. The sooner we, I think, all realize that, the sooner we can go and deliver and execute on the type of systemic vision that Aditya, you referred to, and we can even sooner deliver on the type of new business models that Darias recognized are extraordinarily needed to actually put all of this into action.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights today. This concludes our TDi Sustainability Suits and Boots podcast episode. For our audience, please check out the rest of TDi Sustainability's series of Mining Indaba podcasts. And until next time, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing all of you at Mining Indaba in Cape Town next month.